Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Amelia Pang in support of Made in China and joined in conversation this evening by the Washington Post's Shannon Liao. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open during the event as I will be dropping links to purchase Made in China from Literati. There is also a link to purchase books in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. But if you're watching live, you can submit questions for the Q&A portion using the Q&A feature available to you at the bottom of your screen at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. In lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our events programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Amelia Pang is an award-winning journalist who has written for publications such as Mother Jones and The New Republic. She has covered topics ranging from organic import fraud, the prevalence of sexual violence on Native American reservations. In 2017, the Los Angeles Press Club awarded her first place in investigative journalism for her undercover reporting on the exploitation of smuggled immigrants who were recruited to work in Chinese restaurants. Amelia grew up in a Mandarin-speaking household in Maryland and holds a BA in literary studies from the New School. She lives near Washington, D.C. with her husband, an inorganic farmer, and Made in China is her first book. And speaking with her this evening, Shannon Liao is a staff writer at the Washington Post covering video games. Prior to joining the Post, Liao was a games reporter, at CNN Business, profiling the CEO of Epic Games, breaking industry scoops around business and tech, and contributing the occasional article to other sections. She has also been a tech and culture reporter at The Verge, covering general tech news, Chinese internet culture, cryptocurrency, and the intersection between internet culture, gaming, and politics. While at The Verge, she was on Vox Media's board for the Asian American Employee Resource Group. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Amelia Pang and Shannon Liao into your living rooms.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yay, thanks for having us. Awesome. Okay, maybe I can kick it off to Amelia. Can you tell us about your book? What should we know about it?
Yes, the book opens in 2012 when an American woman named Julie Keith opens up this package of Halloween decorations from Kmart. They're brand new Halloween decorations. And the reason why she's opening them is because she's planning her child's Halloween party, and she's just kind of looking for cheap and new decorations to use. And to her horror, when she's opening up this package, an SOS letter falls out. And it's written by the political prisoner in China who had made and packaged this very product in a labor camp. And it's a really chilling story because the decorations were actually decorative gravestones made of styrofoam, but they were actually manufactured in a labor camp where when the forced laborers died from exhaustion or torture, they were buried in unmarked graves. And here we were selling it in the US to use as decorations for children's parties. So I really, this wasn't the first SOS letter of this kind that was found in the US or the last, but it was one of the more chilling ones in terms of the details and the connections to us. And so every time an SOS letter like this comes out, and usually just some media coverage and a lot of outrage, but rarely do we ever talk about the reasons why this product ended up in our stores, the holes in our supply chain, and the deeply problematic ways that a lot of companies are auditing their Chinese suppliers. And so that's what I want to do with the book, to really explore fundamentally all the different things that went wrong to make make it possible for things that are manufactured in what is essentially a Chinese gulag to end up selling in Kmart.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me, how did you first hear about these SOS letters, and what made you think that it would be worth exploring in a report or in a book?
Yeah, it's, in the Chinese human rights community, these SOS letters is not really an uncommon phenomenon. The first one was actually sent to the US in the 1990s, as early as that. It was written by a political prisoner, a pro-democracy activist named Chen Po-kong. He organized a lot of kind of large-scale pro-democracy protests back in the day. And he was in a labor camp, a forced labor quarry in southern China. And he was just hauling these kinds of rocks during the day and getting injured. And at night, he couldn't go to sleep. He had to stay up to manufacture these artificial flowers that all had English tags. I believe it said it was shipping to Springfield, Illinois. And so he actually knew some English and knew that this was going to the US, and that was what inspired him to write the SOS letter. And when his letter actually, against all odds, arrived in the US, there was, an uproar. It was kind of our first time hearing about it. There were congressional hearings about it. Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi commented on it at the time. But as a society, we all just kind of collectively forgot, and letters like that still continue to arrive in the US and all over the world. And unfortunately, these types of labor camps in China are just growing. So let me back up a little bit and talk about what kinds of people are held in these labor camps and how you end up in one of them. A lot of them are political dissidents, religious dissidents, civil rights activists, ethnic minorities like Uyghurs and Tibetans. A lot of the Hong Kong protesters are in danger of ending up in these camps. Women's rights activists are arrested all the time. And whenever someone is arbitrarily arrested and not really getting a chance to go through court and get a trial and get an official sentence or access to a lawyer, a lot of times they end up in these kinds of extra legal detention centers. These detention centers have all kinds of names, from pretrial detention center to drug detox center, vocational training center, legal education center. But most of them are essentially labor camps where the detainees, they are held there indefinitely, and they have to work 15 to 20 hours a day, often under very torturous conditions, and manufacturing our cheap goods.
Wow. Yeah. So how did this, kind of draw your attention? How did you first get attracted to this topic to start covering it?
Yeah, I really wanted to highlight our connections to this, because it's easy to just say, oh, this is China's problem. This is a problem on the other side of the world. This is an authoritarian regime's problem. But actually, we as consumers are also contributing to the factors that make it easy for, and sometimes even encourage factories to outsource work to forced labor facilities. During my reporting for Made in China, I actually went to labor camps and followed some of the trucks that left these camps. And they went to all kinds of exporters, including an official Apple factory. And I talked to the guards at the camps, and they confirmed there were prisoners inside doing manufacturing work. I would kind of just show up at these camps and say I was from an overseas company that wanted to buy products from them. And they would openly acknowledge that their people inside are prisoners and they can absolutely export products to me. The system is not even hidden in that sense, but our corporations are not searching hard enough to find forced labor in their supply chain. And that does tie in with us as consumers and how we shop, and things that we can do as consumers to address this if we don't want our products to be manufactured in a labor camp. For example, during my research, I found that a lot of times the reason why a Chinese supplier, like an official Chinese supplier, the reason why they would outsource work to a labor camp is because they cannot realistically make the product for that cheap of a price, the price that was offered to them. Another major factor is that they just cannot realistically make it as fast as the production deadline that was offered to them. And that ties back to the way that we shop and the way that we buy. I mean, we're always supporting, for the most part, companies that are able to offer the latest trends for the lowest prices. Right now you're seeing fast fashion become ultra fast fashion. There's brands like Fashion Nova, where the CEO famously said he can turn something from a design into an actual product in less than 24 hours, like actual clothing shipped to him in less than 24 hours. And how is that possible? There's unfortunately a lot of times those official factories simply just don't have enough time to make the product. They have to outsource work to forced laborers who can make the products without payment, and they could stay up 20 hours a day to help our corporations meet our deadlines.
Wow. So I think you mentioned part of this in your response, but I'm curious, what do you think consumers can do when they're shopping to kind of be more responsible? Or maybe is it possible to avoid forced labor when they're shopping?
I would say at this point, I don't think there's any product or any company I could safely say I could guarantee that there's no forced labor in their supply chain, because the way that companies do audits and the amount of what's considered transparent by companies is simply just so little information that you can't tell if they're engaging in any factors that contribute to illegal subcontracting to forced labor. So I think a realistic thing that we can do is that next time we go shopping online at our favorite brand's website, just take a moment and look at their sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page and see exactly what it says. Does it say that they're not sourcing from Xinjiang, where there's a high level of forced labor currently happening with the Uyghurs? Do they say that they're not, do they say what prices they're paying for these products? Is it a price that realistically can support minimum wage in that local region? Do they say how much time they're actually giving factories to make products, what they do when if they make a production change, do they give an extension to the factory? Do they waive fines? A lot of times these are the factors that contribute to unauthorized subcontracting to forced labor camps. But these factors are rarely addressed or revealed in most companies' transparency pages.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And I think, so I just read through your whole book and was really impressed by it. And there's a lot of research that went into this. I'm curious, how long did it take you to research this book?
I started looking into it around 2016, but it's just been an endless. I'm still reading up about what's happening in Xinjiang. I mean, I think it's never ending. I mean, unfortunately, since I ended a book, the camps have gotten so much worse. They are expanding at a rapid pace. Right now, the Uyghurs are being detained. So there's so many of them detained that they can't build the camps fast enough in Xinjiang. So they're moving them out of Xinjiang into other regions, other factories throughout China. And that's called the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program. Last year, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute released a terrific report that found hard evidence of a lot of major global corporations sourcing from factories that are associated with the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program, which is forced labor. And they included some pretty expensive brands, including Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Lacoste, Nike. These are not cheap dollar store brands. So it just comes to show the issue is not limited to the cheap brands like Kmart or dollar stores, although they're certainly a culprit. I really don't know which brand is definitely safe from forced labor. And we really need to, I think, create a transparency 2.0 in a way. Like we have to start, if we don't think that our companies are revealing enough information in their transparency pages and sustainability pages, we need to call them out on Twitter, call them out on Facebook, ask them to reveal these key factors. Otherwise, it's red flags. And you know, if we another issue is that when we do find out that a company is associated with a forced labor camp, like something associated with the Uyghur labor transfer program, a lot of times they're really, really slow to react or to drop the supplier. Some of the companies listed in the Australian Strategic Policy Institute still haven't dropped the suppliers. So one actual step that consumers can take is to go through that list. It's called Uyghurs for Sale. That's the name of the report. Again, it's by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And it just lists 82 major global brands, a lot of them recognizable brands we've all probably shopped from, and call them out like, hey, did you drop that supplier that's associated with forced labor? And even if you did, what changes did you make to your sourcing policies to ensure that your other suppliers aren't using these types of forced labor? Did you even look to see what went wrong in the auditing process that you missed this major red flag? And these are the types of questions that we as consumers can start asking our companies and start holding them accountable. Because at this rate, it doesn't look like the government is going to or has been historically able to do much.
Yeah, can you talk more about, how maybe the American government, the U.S. government has responded to different factories coming out as using forced labor? How have they responded?
Historically, the response has been pretty weak. In the 90s, there were some attempts to form an agreement with China regarding the forced labor issue when we were first finding out about it. But the U.S. government, according to our agreement with China, the U.S. government is supposed to be able to send people to inspect facilities in China that are suspected of exporting forced labor goods to the U.S. to confirm that it's a regular factory and the people there are not under forced labor conditions and the people there are not prisoners. But China rarely actually grants the U.S. government that access, or sometimes they'll grant the access 10 years later after all the evidence is gone. And nobody in the US government has ever really stood up to China about that this agreement was never really strongly enforced, not by Trump, not by anyone. And even in the last administration, we saw with the trade negotiations, human rights was not really brought up as a talking point in the trade negotiations. But you kind of have to talk about human rights if you want to fundamentally address this issue through US policies. There's been a number of initiatives that in the last administration that did happen to address it, like it's smaller scale. There's been bans on cotton products from Xinjiang, tomato products, because there's evidence that there's a very high rate of forced labor. There's no way to prove that things manufactured in that region wasn't produced by forced labor at this point. Auditors cannot independently go there to verify. But what's still stalling is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is a really important and potentially powerful legislation if it can get passed. What that would do is it would ban all products from Xinjiang, not just certain types of products or certain specific products. And that's really key if we want to talk about anything that could potentially push Chinese government to rethink its policies towards forced labor, especially towards Uyghur forced labor. Because the Chinese government has invested so much money in the Xinjiang region to develop it economically. It's a kind of a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road is this $1 trillion economic development strategy. It's almost too big to fail. And Xinjiang is kind of this key part that connects China to trading partners in Europe and Central Asia, West Asia, and and Middle East. It's just this huge, strategically important region. And we've been seeing that with each major investment in the Belt and Road Initiative out in Xinjiang, there's been a clamping down on Uyghurs. And so we know that the oppression of the Uyghurs and the worsening of it in recent years has been intricately connected to trade. So since it was trade that started it, it's trade that can stop it. And we as consumers are trade. We need to start asking companies, are you still sourcing from Xinjiang? And if you are you willing to pull out?
Right. And you also mentioned how it's been difficult for the U.S. government to get the access to China they need to kind of enforce to avoid forced labor. Wondering if there's also been limited access for journalists going into China. Has it been challenging to report on China? How can media hold China accountable for these kinds of things like forced labor camps?
Yeah, there's been a lot of good reporting, although in Xinjiang and for the Uyghur related camps, it is much harder to get good reporting done because, the surveillance there, it's much tighter. I mean, in Xinjiang, you have these AI enabled surveillance cameras, which can, through machine learning, track everyone in real time and flag people if they're not attending a patriotic flag raising ceremony, for example. They'll get flagged, and then the police will have to check in on them later on and possibly send them to a re-education camp, which a lot of times forced labor does occur. So the level of surveillance is really unprecedented and something that doesn't exist throughout China yet. It's mostly in the Xinjiang region, so it's really hard to get reporting done there. So I actually didn't go to Xinjiang for that reason. I didn't think I could actually safely get reporting done and not get caught. So I stuck to the cities like Shanghai, where there was a lot of tourism. So it didn't necessarily, you didn't necessarily stand out to the police if you showed up at a major city and you're a foreigner. And I have a foreign passport, so that's why, even though I'm of Chinese and Uyghur descent. And when I actually in the bigger cities compared to Xinjiang, it's surprisingly easy to get reporting done on labor camps. You can just go there. You can just show up and talk to the guards. Nobody says anything. Nobody stops you. You can, or even from afar, you can call a lot of these labor camps. A lot of them do have their numbers publicly listed, like these drug detox centers that are all essentially reopened labor camps. And you can call them and ask them, are you making products? Can you sell products to me from a company that wants to buy from you? And they absolutely will agree. It's like I said earlier, it's not hidden. Like if I, as an individual journalist, could find out this information, then companies with millions of dollars can definitely find out a lot more than what I was able to if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you a question that people have asked me, but has speaking Mandarin been a benefit for you in reporting about China?
I think so, because I could kind of just blend in when I was at the labor camps talking to the guards. They assumed I was working with some kind of a Chinese manufacturer maybe, and it didn't really raise red flags when I showed up at the camps to talk to people in a way that if a white person did, it might have. They might not have been as open.
Mm-hmm. And has there kind of been anything with the Chinese that you speak, the accent that you have, that kind of helped you fit in any case?
It did. I was nervous because I definitely have an American accent when I speak Chinese. I was born here and I grew up here. But I think it's because China is so diverse in terms of dialects. It's not really so strange if you speak with an accent is different from that local region. So ended up being fine.
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool. And one of the things in the book that really stood out to me was this very careful retelling of Sun Yi's life and his story. And maybe you can kind of give some background for folks who haven't read your book yet, but how did you kind of come across Sun Yi's story, and why did you decide to make him a focal point of the book?
Yeah, he was just this incredibly soft-spoken person, but he just had this will of steel. He was this hardcore activist that endured years of imprisonment and torture under conditions that most people, I think, would have given up. But he just really believed in the idea of a freer China, like a non-authoritarian China. Was trying to work towards that. He was really intelligent. He went to university. He studied engineering. And he went to college actually in the 80s when China was first opening up, and he was really curious about kind of some Western intellectual ideas. He liked to read Hegel. He was just this really interesting person who had dreams of traveling the world. He fell in love with his wife in college. That's where they met in the city of Chongqing, even though they were both from other places. And due to China's complicated hukou system, it seemed like they may not have been able to get married, and their relationship kind of fell apart. And this is this kind of epic love story where they reconnected and were able to end up together despite all the societal factors that were fighting against them. And it's this kind of heartbreaking story where even though they try so hard to be together, in the end, they have to be separated so many times by his political activism and having him end up in these labor camps. And, I just thought there were really a lot of really compelling human elements to his story. And I really wanted to show that he was this full-dimensional human being that is not so different from you and I, or listeners here today, or the consumers buying the products he made. But unfortunately, he had to be in a labor camp manufacturing our cheap goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really, kind of struck by his story as you were telling it, and I was so impressed that, it kind of felt like the reader, is in his life, the way that you described everything. So can you kind of walk us through how did you kind of recreate those scenes from his life?
Yeah, well, I interviewed him a lot through Skype before he passed away, unfortunately, and I would ask him, just whenever he told me about some of the torture scenes or what life was like in the camp, or anything about his life, I always stopped or went back to ask more about the sensory details, like what were the colors, what were the smells, what were the textures of that room, what were you feeling, what were you thinking, especially during some of the really intense and crazy long torture that he was going through. What did he think of to actually get him through that? Especially being locked away in a labor camp for more than 2 years. What were the memories that he would revisit the most to give him that sense of comfort from his old life? A lot of these details, I think he didn't really get. Sometimes I feel like I'm a really annoying person to do interviews, because people are like, this is not that important. I want to talk about like torture and the policies and the big things. Like, stop asking me about these sensory details. but I think they are really, really important to properly tell someone's story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just thinking as a journalist myself and seeing how you were able to portray his love story with his wife, I was also wondering, like, how is he feeling telling you all of this, as he's also maybe talking about the other things going on in his life. So thanks for sharing that.
He was like oddly romantic. Like he like sent me the poems that he wrote to his wife back in the day. He kept all of them. Like he just had that streak. You don't always meet people like that who can talk about it in detail. But no, he was definitely a fascinating character.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm also wondering, you said it was really easy to actually visit these labor camps and these prisons, but how are you feeling as you're going to these places, and was it nerve-wracking to kind of have to go undercover?
Yeah, it was. I I wasn't sure if I should go to China initially on a tourism visa or a journalism visa. If you go on a journalism visa, you do have a lot more protections if you get arrested. Tourism visa, it's kind of like, yeah, you'll probably be fine, but it's not like guaranteed. um, but I ended up going on a tourism visa in the end because it's just, I mean, everyone basically, I talked to a lot of journalists in China, and they basically said there's no way you can get away with not being tracked if you go on a journalism visa. When you're reporting on this type of topic, you're probably not going to get much done otherwise, unless you just have a lot of resources that could help you trick the police and not follow you. I ended up just going on a tourism visa, and there was always kind of that fear and that risk a little bit in the back of my head. But luckily, I didn't get detained. I think they just have too many people to track, and they're like, I know they have facial recognition technology in the cameras, but it's not quite advanced enough to literally be able to track anyone at all times throughout China. So I think for those reasons, I was actually able to just go and be fine.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed in the end of your author's note at the end of the book, hopefully no spoilers, but you say that you've actually been writing this while you have family in China and they don't know that you're writing those. So have you thought about that as you were working on this book, what would happen to them and what could happen to them?
Yeah, I think about them a lot, and I don't know. I'm afraid to ask them because I don't want to get it. I don't want it to get flagged on WeChat or something if they're not already being watched. But I just want to say that they had nothing to do with the book. A lot of them are actually really patriotic Chinese people, and if they knew about the book, they would be so angry with me. So I mean, I think you kind of have to be that way a lot of times in China to survive, and that's why Suni, this character, was, and all the dissidents in China are just such rare and special individuals to come across.
Mm-hmm.
The risks that you face to your life is so high.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of on the same line, same kind of train of thought as that, wondering, as you're reporting this such a harrowing subject matter, so how did you kind of handle your mental health and make sure that you were not incredibly stressed out reporting on this?
I didn't do a very good job with that. I think I have a good answer.
Okay.
But I do want to, and like, I know we're kind of getting close to the Q&A part, but I do want to say that this is ultimately still a book about hope. I know we talk about a lot of dark things, and it can often feel hopeless, or just feel like it's just another terrible issue that's happening in the world right now. But there are actionable things that we can do as consumers, small changes in the way that we shop that could really make a world's difference. Like, for example, the next time we want to just buy the latest fast fashion trend because it's cheap and it's new, just take a day to think about it. And more often than not, I feel like if I just take a day to really think about it, the next day I feel like I don't even want it anymore. A lot of times it's just so fleeting, our desires. And I mean, if more of us started doing that, I think that would collectively remove a lot of these factors that force companies to just be constantly searching for ways to shorten the production deadline more and more and more. Like, if we as consumers can show companies that we care, we actually do care about ethical manufacturing. We are not comfortable with products being manufactured in a labor camp where torture and sexual violence against women is so prevalent. We we don't want to contribute to this problem anymore, then a lot of corporations will have to kind of shift the way that they do their business plans if it's no longer lucrative to be constantly searching for ways to shorten the production deadline. Like, for example, let's say a company like H&M or Walmart, any of them, if they put in a production order for 10,000 black hats, but then a celebrity in the US suddenly starts wearing lime green hats, and now everybody wants to adjust their order to meet the latest fast fashion trend. When they adjust that order from black hats to green hats, that's a pretty significant change. Are they giving the factory enough time to make that change? Are they waiving fines so that factories won't feel this kind of intense pressure to make it against all costs, no matter what? These are kind of factors that we as consumers contribute to, and that corporations can control as well. So, I think it's still, at the end of the day, just a simple change in the way that we consume our goods and our relationship with our goods and our companies can really significantly reduce a lot of the factors that push factories to outsource work to labor camps in China. Because a lot of these Chinese suppliers, they don't necessarily want to break the contract or the rules with the brand, and use forced labor in a labor camp. And not just necessarily all evil, greedy Chinese factories. A lot of times they're kind of just pushed to the wall and have no choice. Because there's so many factories in China. They're also competitive with each other. It can be really, really hard to get a major contract with a big brand. It's really, they don't really want to do anything to risk upsetting the brand or losing that contract. So they don't necessarily want to break the rules until they're left with no choice. So if companies can start showing their suppliers in China that they're actually really serious about the forced labor issue, then it could really make a significant change. I mean, it doesn't even have to cost the company that much money. For instance, all a company could do is maybe potentially just say, hey, I'm rewriting our contract with you to say I may periodically send someone to follow your trucks to see if you have relationships with any labor camps, because we take this very seriously. We don't want you to be sourcing from forced labor. Then that's going to stop a lot of factories in their tracks when they're considering sourcing from forced labor, because they don't want to get caught. They're doing it because they know that it's very unlikely they would get caught. The way that a lot of our companies design audits at the moment, it's not really designed to detect something like secret subcontract and forced labor. It just can't do it. So I don't know, these are all things. My book lists a lot of like just actionable things that we need to address, and that we could take action, the questions that we can ask our companies to really create more sustainable businesses.
Do you believe that it starts with customers, kind of holding companies accountable, or is it also that people can, appeal to the U.S. government, or what kind of avenues do you think they have for creating change?
I think it has to come from both ends. We as consumers need to start telling our companies, hey, it will still be lucrative for you if you actually source sustainably. We're not just going to be chasing the latest trends for the cheapest prices, not all of us. And governments also need to step up too. I think that also starts with us as individuals. It would help if we all started calling our representatives and asking them to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which again would ban all products from Xinjiang, just one region with a high level of forced labor, and in a region of huge economic importance to China. So just passing this one act could be really strong leverage in terms of pushing China to rethink its forced labor policies. So there are things that we can do as consumers and as just citizens, as responsible citizens on both ends, to push our companies and push our governments to do better.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if we have to break for Q&A yet, but I did have one more question if there's time. But just, you know, when people are criticizing the China for forced labor, they also sometimes bring up, I mean, other people who might defend China, or they might, lob criticism back at the American prison system. So I kind of wonder if you could talk about, how is China's forced labor system different from America's prison system?
Yeah, that's a great question. Shane Bauer, the Mother Jones journalist, wrote a terrific book called American Prison, which is about actually this topic, how American prisons functioned very similarly to labor camps for a really long time. But ever since the war on drugs, actually, there's just been such a large influx of American prisoners that there's actually not enough jobs for all of them, and most of them are not even working anymore. There's just too many prisoners and not enough jobs. So unfortunately, the US didn't really do better because of a ethical policy change, but it was unfortunately the drug war that turned our prisons, stopped them from being labor camps. Because they were very much still working with private companies for many years, and some still are, but it's just that the numbers, the scope is just, it can't be compared to China, where pretty much every detainee, whether it's a prisoner or someone who hadn't even been sentenced yet, they're all pretty much doing manufacturing work, and a lot of them are working with exporters.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a line in your book where you say that the United Nations wouldn't consider that illegal. Is that true? Like the United Nations wouldn't consider forced labor of China to be illegal?
Oh, you said the United Nations?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, technically, strictly speaking, prison labor is not forced labor, and there's a distinction. And yeah, so technically, even prisoners in China, like in the prisons, the people who have gone to court and been sentenced, they're not considered forced laborers if they're doing manufacturing work and exporting goods to us. But oftentimes the conditions are really, really similar to labor camps. A lot of people are tortured. They have to work 15 to 20 hours a day. They don't have access to medical care. They don't have any protections where they're working. They're often getting injured. And these are just really unsanitary conditions that you don't want your products being made in. But prisons are just one type of this kind of labor facility. There's also so many extra legal detention centers where people have not been sentenced. They're just dissidents who have disappeared into these places, disappeared for an indefinite period of time. And these facilities all have kind of innocuous names like drug detox centers, vocational training centers, pretrial detention centers that sound, it doesn't sound like a labor camp, but the conditions are pretty similar. Most of them, they are very much labor camps.
Wow. Yeah. I see that we have a couple of questions coming in, but I think we have 2 more minutes before the Q&A starts. So if anyone else wants to get their questions in, then we can start going over them. But yeah, thank you for going through all of that. I'm also wondering, you mentioned a writer at Mother Jones, but what are some other writers or books that you would recommend, or writers that you've enjoyed reading from?
Well, this is kind of an old book, but my favorite one of all time is Random Family. Have you read that? But it's just this beautiful, beautiful nonfiction book where the writer Adrienne LeConte spends 10 years following this group of families in the Bronx. And you just get such an in-depth look at their daily lives. And it's a very moving portrait of this kind of underrepresented community that really humanizes them. I love it. I love it so much. It's been years since I read it, and I still find myself thinking about the characters. I'm wondering what happened to them, and just feeling like they are kind of a part of me. I mean, it was just such a great book. I love it. Recommend everyone to read it if you haven't.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't read that, but I did go to high school in the Bronx, so that is kind of a subject that would be near and dear to me.
That's right.
That's great. And then I know you already went over this earlier on, the differences, the news that's come out of China since you've published your book, but has there been any other headlines that have come up since you published your book, or hasn't published, or like it hasn't, I guess people still haven't bought it yet, but since you finished writing the book to now, have there been any headlines that have caught your eye?
Yeah, the BBC recently released a really disturbing but terrific report about the sexual violence that the Uyghur forced laborers face in these Xinjiang camps. Is just so prevalent, a systemic rape, they call it. And there's even reports of women being sold to and kind of pimped out in these labor camps. That's kind of something new that we're finding out. And it's so disturbing. Actually, after these women are raped again and again, they a lot of times do manufacturing work, making our cheap goods. So that's something that I think more people should be aware of.
Wow. Are we supposed to start Q&A now?
Okay. Yes, I think we could transition to the Q&A. I do have a few questions, and I can read them off for us. I think we might have time for more. So if you do have a question, you can feel free to submit it in the Q&A feature, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. The first question, Carla writes, today a report came out that the Chinese government's alleged actions in Xinjiang have violated every single provision in the United Nations Genocide Convention, according to an independent report by more than 50 global experts in human rights, war crimes, and international law. Does it give you more hope?
I think
Xinjiang,
so.
excuse me.
Oh, yes, Xinjiang, yes. It does give me hope because, yes, there's more and more countries that are starting to be willing to call this a genocide, call it for what it is. The US was the first to do so, and followed by Canada and the Netherlands. And as we see more hard evidence that this is a genocide, I mean, there's suppression of birth rates, there's a large number of people that are being killed in these camps. As we're seeing evidence of that, I think slowly there's going to have to be more countries coming together and being allies and standing up to China in regards to this particular issue.
There's a question, if you have any thoughts about the Epoch Times / Falun Gong media empire, which on the one hand is very anti-CCP, but on the other hand, has aggressively promoted disinformation in this country.
Yeah, I am not part of that. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not necessarily a phenomenon that's unique to the Epoch Times. I did see that a lot of Chinese dissidents were a lot of different kinds of Chinese dissidents, including Ai Weiwei, were ended up being taken by Trump's kind of strongman demeanor in terms of how it looked like he was standing up to China. Though I would argue, he could have done a lot more. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act didn't get passed under his administration, and he never brought up talking points, human rights as a talking point during the trade negotiations when he had all the leverage against China. But yeah, no, a lot of Chinese human rights dissidents and in the US and outside of China have kind of started to support Trump. But, these people, a lot of them they tend to be pro-US government, regardless of the administration. So hopefully we will start to see people kind of getting on board the Biden administration. I know it's still early on. People are waiting to see what he's going to do about China. But I think a lot of these Chinese immigrants, they don't necessarily are quite aware of maybe how bad some of Trump's other rhetoric sounds. They just hear kind of these anti-CCP rhetoric and really kind of resonate with that. But I don't know, the Biden administration is still early. Maybe we will see some changes down the line.
I think we have time for one more question. And Lynn writes, do you know of an example of a company which has successfully pushed back and changed suppliers or influenced the Chinese company to change their practice? So you talked about on the level of politics, but I guess the question is on the level of trade or in the private sector movement on those grounds.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the company that did the right thing, but consumers and the media that really pushed them to do so. But one example would be Badger Sports. They were one of the first to get called out for sourcing from Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang early on. And they're this company that manufactures athletic wear for a lot of colleges and universities and American schools. And there was evidence that some of their clothing were made by Uyghur forced laborers. And there was a lot of, because that was the first one, there was so much media exposure. It just the company felt so much pressure from consumers that they actually just dropped that supplier and said, oh, we're not sourcing from Xinjiang anymore. That was the last one. And that was pretty significant, but unfortunately, since then, there's just been so much more information coming out about all these different companies that are still sourcing from Xinjiang, and now our attention is kind of divided, and hasn't been as much pushback against it, and a lot of companies are pretty slow to pull out of Xinjiang.
Thank you. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, but Amelia Pang, Shannon Liao, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. Of course, you can purchase Made in China at our website. There's links in the description below. If you're watching on YouTube, there are links in the chat if you have been watching us live. Hope we can have you both in the bookstore sometime in the future when it is safe to do so and we're all traveling again. But until then, we continue to hope that you stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. And we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And we will see you at the next event. So take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Literati Bookstore. Really encourage everyone to support local bookstores right now. That's such an important part of the community. Buy something from Literati, even if it's not my book. Support local bookstores.
Thank you so much. Take care, all.